I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. This week, Times opinion contributor and Ish Entertainment CEO Michael Hirschorn explores how Zohran Mamdani's outsider campaign in New York mirrors the national forces that shaped Donald Trump's rise, and how our city's politics could be a key indicator for America's future. But first, Astead Herndon, political reporter for The Times. He's just published a deep profile of Zohran Mamdani. He examines not only his surprising rise at mayoral race, but the movement's voter activism and strategic calculations remaking New York politics. His reporting explores how candidates like Mamdani balance principle and pragmatism at a moment when city leadership feels uncertain and the national eyes are on New York. Astead, tell me, you've been covering Mamdani for a long time, watching him grow, watching him listening to voters. How has he changed your mind about his candidacy?
Yeah, I started on this story the day of the primary, and my question was both how did he get to that point for the victory, but also kind of what is he looking at going forward? What's the motivations for this type of candidate? And so I was able to see both the policy and the politics at the same time. And I think the biggest thing that comes through is this is someone who is clear-eyed in their value, but is understanding that the executive role of mayor, is not going to really allow him to live that out in the fullest sense. And so what he's done since the primary, and what our story really focused on, was the efforts he has made to kind of moderate himself, or at least present a more universalist version of himself to people who are skeptical as that primary run was happening, but people he knows are going to be important when it comes to governing the city. So these are real estate leaders. These are business leaders. These are folks in tech. These are folks in finance. People who, his promises to raise a corporate tax rate, his promises for a millionaire's tax, sometimes put those people kind of at odds with him, much less his DSA views and some of his pro-Palestinian advocacy. In these meetings, he basically tries to say, we have a lot more in common than we do, we have a lot more in common than separates us. And he's been fairly successful in that, to the point where a lot of those people who were initially considering Cuomo or others have basically resigned themselves not just to the inevitability of his victory, but actually joining up with him and looking ahead to when he is in office to find areas of policy common ground.
How does he avoid not alienating his base and not having these people who are skeptical thinking that he's merely pandering?
Absolutely. It's a huge point. And I think to the second point, pandering is only a matter of authenticity, right? The difference between pandering, working, and not working is whether someone believes you. And the real skill he has is frankly charming, frankly a person who is earnest in those values, and folks are really coming to that, I think, in one way. But the problem you identify in the first about keeping the base with him is an important one. As he has made some of these overtures to the center and others, there is increasingly some rumblings among some of the DSA crowd and some of the younger folks who really appreciated his kind of ardent, strident, particularly on Palestinian advocacy, where he's changed a little bit of his language. One of the things we reported was that, he used to call himself an anti-Zionist. Now he more so talks about it in terms of, I support Palestinian rights. Does that mean he's changed his values? Not necessarily, but it does mean he's presenting a different version.
Is he anti-Zionist?
So when we talked about that, it could be, I think it speaks to different definitions of the word. He's on the Daily today saying specifically, I don't believe in any place's right to exist on its face without the following of international criminal law. That's his go-to answer, is to say that he believes Israel as it is existing is breaking the law, and that's his focus. And so he compares it to Saudi Arabia, compares it to other countries where we would say that, but I'm saying the self-identification is what has changed. So when someone asks him about Zionism, he'll reject it, but he's not fronting that. You know what I'm saying? And that's a change from 8 years ago to now. And I think in general, there's been a maturation of the left over some years. These are folks who, Bernie Sanders' initial campaign for a lot of people was their first entry into politics. And over that time, they've grown on the Albany level. But more importantly, I think as the Democratic Party has experienced some problems, DSA and the work and I think leftist organizers have been living in the failures of the Democratic Party for a while. They've been going on these door knocking saying they're not focusing on affordability. They're not focusing on things that actually tangibly matter to working class people. Since that's been exposed, I think, after the election, it's really created an opportunity for a lot of them to gobble up some of the same voters that turned away from Democrats in November, be it working class people of color, first generation Americans, young people, young men. All of those are groups Mamdani's really succeeded with.
What is a democratic socialist?
You know, what he would say, I mean, the formal answer is the Democratic Socialists of America are a growing political org that I think is most associated with Bernie Sanders, and I think would define themselves as a combination of kind of democratic principles and the class-based socialist politics. And so they don't think in the kind of traditional liberal language that will deprioritize class. They would say class will always be the language you need to be speaking in first. And they would identify some of the Democrats' failures over the last several years of not creating those class coalitions. So when I asked Mamdani about who he thought his campaign was for when he was starting, the first thing he says, besides, he says Muslims, South Asians, kind of groups he had naturally had political homes with, but he says renters too. And I think that's really where you see the DSA politics at hand, is because they see that as a group of people who are a political bloc. And I've never heard Democrats, for example, on the national level, talk about renters. They'll talk about homeowners. They'll talk about small business owners. He's talking about, I think, a class of the working poor, which I think is what they would say is a much larger and ignored group of people.
He's 33 years old. He was a relatively undistinguished assemblyman.
Yeah.
What makes him think he can run New York City?
I think I asked them that point, and the thing that he would say is he's acknowledging his lack of experience. That what he's been doing over these meetings in several months, I mentioned the business leaders and tech folks and stuff, he's also done a ton of meetings with just municipal leaders, with city government folks from years past to say, what do I not know? How do I, and he's made some specific promises in those, to have a team of rivals, to not have litmus tests on policy issues for the folks he surrounds himself with. And he's made a continuous point to say that he's open to keeping NYPD Commissioner Jessica Tisch on board, and has made a 180 on his policing, the thing he is very open about.
So why should we believe him?
100%. I think, to me, the transition that happens with Democrats on policing is not unique to Zohran Mamdani. There's a lot of people who in 2020 were saying things like defund who are not saying those things now. And I also think the ways in which he's changed are a lot smaller than the ways in which he stayed the same, And, he asked them kind of this question about all of, are you kind of being whoever people want you to be? And he said, if I was planning this, like, why would I, start a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter in college? Why would I start these things that were actually controversial, like in through my life and career? And I think that's true, And so I don't want to say it as if there's no reason not to trust. There's a lot of reasons. You can believe that lack of experience. You can, and I think you can feel that the city might require folks who kind of lead from a business perspective. There's a lot, so I think there's a lot of fair critiques of it. But I would say, having spent time with him, is he's well aware of those. And he's not going into it blind of those. He's going into it acknowledging those. And so, different than Bill de Blasio, I think 8 years ago, who did not reach out to rivals, who weren't down with a progressive agenda, who had a difficult relationship with policing. He's trying to proactively combat those issues by creating a larger coalition, and I think specific to policing, making concessions.
How do you think he would change as mayor?
Well, I think the ways he would change as mayor are the ways we've seen him change. I think the ways I've identified is a what I would call a soft launch of Mayor Mamdani. I think that it would be more willing to put some distance between him and some on the left, right? A good example of here is the millionaire's tax. I talked to the co-chair of the local DSA who says, the millionaire's tax is a core component of what we see as the platform. And Mamdani is now saying that it's about what we fund, not how we fund. He is creating an open lane for presumably Kathy Hochul or others to find different ways to gain revenue that don't have to be a millionaire's tax as long as he gets the free buses. And so that right there is a difference between candidate of 2 years ago or kind of initially getting in and how the folks are thinking about mayor, and is a potential place of vulnerability for him. I think that in a world in which some of those young people, some of those DSA members do believe that core to the political project are things like taxing the rich. And so if he steps away from that, do they allow that distance? If he reaffirms Israel's right to existence or things he said in other places, does he have protesters from the left, a thing that he has rarely had in his career? All of things I think are open questions that we're going to see going forward.
It's sort of ironic that the last immigrant mayor, if I'm correct, was the first Jewish mayor. He said he was exhausted with always feeling like a minority. But his father's reply to that changed his perspective. How did that happen?
Yeah, I really like this moment. I was talking to him about identity politics. I was saying, I think a lot of times we just assert, politicians' demographics and we just assume the ways it's impacted them. I wanted to put it in front of him. What are the ways you've grown up in the communities you've surrounded yourself with shape and impact your politics? And the thing that he said was, I think, an interesting one about, at first, he felt beaten down by the fact that he was kind of a composite of multiple worlds. You think about an Indian in Uganda, you think about a first-generation American in New York, or whether he's growing up at Bronx, in all those different situations, he was saying how he's kind of felt marginalized. And he was saying that was weighing on him kind of emotionally. But his father, as you said, told him, and I think a lot of, this is a conversation I feel like I remember having with my parents. His father told him that to be a minority is to see the truth in those places rather than the fiction. And so, there's a lot of ways that people who are on the outside of something can kind of see it more clearly. And he was saying that really allowed him to step into his own power, to his own politics, and be comfortable with that. And say, maybe the composite of this world adds up to something unique, not something that I should cower from. And, I think it's important to say politics is his second act, He tried to find stardom in other ways, be it a rapper, be it his mom's movies or whatever. But I think this is someone who was always trying to find a way to blend the values with I think, the advocacy.
And did he succeed?
I would say that what they accomplished in the primary is historic. The nature of the win against those candidates, former governor, former mayor, incumbent mayor, I think should be treated for the special movement it was. I think we'll learn more in the general election, but remember that primary day, there was a belief that Cuomo and Adams could usurp him come November. That's almost completely dissipated, partially because of the growth that he has had. And so I think he has been successful in terms of modeling a new type of politics as the Democratic Party itself is searching for one. What will be interesting, if we're thinking on the national level, is how does that play in 2028? How does that play in other parts of the country? How does that play with a different messenger? And I think, though, we're going to get those test tries.
Astead Herndon of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. Coming up next, connecting Zohran Mamdani's New York upsurge to Trump-inspired political shifts. I'd like to welcome Times opinion contributor Michael Hirschorn. He caught our attention with his recent guest essay in the New York Times. He connects the outsider energy of the Zohran Mamdani campaign to the same broad forces that helped put Donald Trump in the White House at a time when the nation is watching New York as a bellwether for the future of American politics. He currently is the CEO of Ish Entertainment, writes about the intersection between entertainment and politics. Michael, what makes Donald Trump and Zohran Mamdani similar?
Well, I'll say the only thing, and it's a big thing, is emotional appeal. And I think there's a misunderstanding at the core of the center of the Democratic Party, which is that you can discern what voters want. You do a ton of polling, and you say, okay, they're interested in these types of issues, and then you kind of give them those issues back. The Mamdani campaign is like the Trump campaign, has figured out what's the emotional trigger that is going to get people inspired and excited. And that's what he's been doing very clearly and from the start. And And that's a crucial lesson, I think, for Democrats that a lot of them are just not paying attention to.
His issue is affordability. Did he take a poll to find that out?
Well, there's the legend of what he did, and I can't prove, I'm not a reporter, so my understanding of what he did is that he did a 5-borough listening tour. He talked to Trump supporters, and he got the sense that this was the core crisis in New York City, which of course it is, and decided that that's what he was going to build his campaign around. And I think, like Trump, freeze the rent is literally build the wall. It is simple. It's maybe a good idea, maybe not a good idea, but it encapsulates the essence of what he's about. And I think so much of politics at this point is tribal, so that if you understand this guy is in your corner, and everything about him suggests he's the guy for the working class. He's also the guy for, a lot of college liberals, who live in Brooklyn and Queens and downtown Manhattan. But once he cemented that tribal identity, he cemented that tribal allegiance, then he had his voters.
Free buses, he probably can't do on his own. The MTA is controlled by the state. Some of the other things may not be within his purview also. Freezing rent, how do landlords pay for improvements? Some of these ideas have emotional appeal. Are they, in fact, good policy?
Probably not, actually. And I know de Blasio froze the rent, I think, 3 times throughout his 2 terms. One was during COVID, so I think that was completely understandable. There are nonprofit supporters of public housing and of affordable housing who believe freezing the rent could in fact precipitate a return to the 70s in New York. A lot of landlords, particularly in the Bronx, are not super wealthy. I know Related has a huge chunk of housing, affordable housing in New York, but a lot of them are small businessmen or people who are actually can't afford the New York City taxes as it is. So freezing the rent could be problematic. There are a lot of studies that show that increasing the supply, essentially universally studies show that increasing the supply of affordable housing is the best way to keep rents down. So the hope is, or my hope is that he understands that he has the suppleness and the broadness of vision to not do something dogmatic that could be destructive. But we have to hope, and I think that's also very Trumpian, right? Is that he understood that if he made the argument that I just made in this media environment, nobody would hear it.
Is he a communist, a socialist, a populist, a Democrat? What is he?
Well, he ran as a Democrat, so I'll say he's a Democrat. I would say he's a populist, and I think there again there's a Trump parallel. I would say the danger that he does something. I got a lot of feedback, especially from Jewish New Yorkers, about what a threat he is to Jewish New Yorkers. I don't think he's remotely a threat. I don't think he's going to do anything particularly destructive to the city. If anything, I think the vector he's on is going to be to move a bit to the center, and probably the first break will be with people pretty far to the left who may feel sold out by him.
Can he govern? We saw a lot of this idealism with John Lindsay, probably the best analogy. And I remember some of the Lindsay people telling me in retrospect, we didn't have enough grown-ups with us. Obviously, there's a great deal of idealism attached to Mamdani. Is he going to have enough grown-ups with him?
I honestly have no idea, and I can only hope that he is. My understanding of what's happening behind the scenes is that he's having the right conversations. I do hope he brings somebody like a Brad Lander in as a really able number 2. I don't know if that's going to happen. Lander's an interesting character because he's somebody who has unimpeachable progressive credentials, but is incredibly practical and has the ability to actually get things done. So I'd love to see him go in that direction.
Why did Trump do relatively well in Ocasio-Cortez's district?
Yeah, so the really interesting statistic was Trump 2 years ago, or in 2022, I think he got about 20% of the vote in AOC's district. He got 33% of the vote in 2024, and Ocasio-Cortez was at around 70%. And Ocasio-Cortez went on I think it was Instagram or Twitter, and asked her supporters to say, why did this happen? And they said, we see you very similarly, like that you're both, and in one case it's total BS, but they said, we see you and Donald Trump as being anti-establishment and for the working class. You're both for the people. And I think that's core to this shift that's happening, right? That people either feel that you're an establishment person, that you represent your donors, you're too close to Wall Street, you represent PAC money, APAC is a big deal, and that Trump and certain types of folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene on the right and AOC on the left represent a more authentic voice that's in support of the people.
Is there an establishment that he's running against? And what does that do for Andrew Cuomo, who is courting that establishment?
Right. I think the thing that's really fascinating about, again, both Trump and Mamdani have kind of exposed the establishment. Like there was a vague sense that there was an establishment, and now everybody's kind of come out of the woodwork. And you see Bill Ackman donating $1 million to an anti-Mamdani effort. Various people like John Katsimasidis has threatened to shut down all the Gristedes supermarkets. And if you have to go to one of the Gristedes supermarkets, that might not be such a bad thing. Other people threatening to leave and go to Florida or go out to East Hampton. Everyone's come out of the woodwork.
Bloomberg not, though.
Bloomberg, I'm not quite clear on what Bloomberg has done. I don't think he's definitely not come out in favor of Mamdani. Yeah, he's kept his counsel, I think.
And what about the Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, who have not yet endorsed?
Yeah, I am surprised. I understand some of the context around that. I understand that if you're Hakeem Jeffries, you're not just representing your district, you are representing the Democrats in the House. And the pathway to Democratic control in 2026 includes the suburbs of New York. And the suburbs of New York are not necessarily going to react as favorably to Mamdani, obviously. And these are very purple areas. And, Tom Suozzi out in Nassau County has a bit of Flushing and Queens, has, very aggressively said that Mamdani should leave the Democratic Party. This is a clear and aggressive appeal to a lot of ethnic voters who are kind of trending rightward. The thing with Jeffries is Mamdani won a huge majority in his district. I mean, he represents one of the most progressive districts. It's been dubbed part of the commie corridor in jest. And there's a young assemblyman named Chiose, who's a really phenomenal performer, who's very progressive and very competent. And there's now a lot of word that Ose may primary Jeffries from the left.
You wrote that Mamdani's message would reverberate pretty well in Iowa. Why not Nassau County?
I think the lesson of Mamdani is not necessarily leftism. It's a kind of hyper-localism. And I think it's getting rid of the encrustations of like, this is what the Democratic Party has stood for traditionally. And I think what he did was made a decision based on really talking to constituents to say these are the things that they actually care about. And if those ideas kind of rub against democratic orthodoxy, that's okay. So to me, that's the lesson. It's not that you should run on the left. I do think that running anti-establishment, running against elites, running against oligarchs, and running against billionaires, it's currently left-coded, but it doesn't have to be. So I think that option is available to somebody in Kansas or Iowa or Nassau County.
You said that divergence politically is no longer really left-right, it's more top-bottom. What do you mean?
I mean that there's a sense among, I mean, I think there's something akin to a Tea Party forming on the left, equivalent to what happened, starting with Newt Gingrich on the right, and then moving on through the 2000s. So I think it's about allegiance, and it's about tribalism, and the Democratic Party became very associated with Wall Street. There came the sense that the Democratic Party was willing to do the bidding of its wealthiest donors, that it was willing to do the bidding of AIPAC. And so I think it's that distinction that is the key difference between this kind of class-based politics. The people can sense inauthenticity, and they need to understand that you're on their side and that you're not bought out.
Why is Mamdani so attractive to young men?
Well, in my article, I noted there was a poll, and the poll's like, it's a little bit of an outlier, and it's a crosstab, but the number was so astonishing, right? So I had written earlier this year about the democratic crisis with young men, right? There was a massive shift to Trump, and Mamdani was polling at 85% of men 18 to 34.
It's amazing.
It's an astonishing, it's like a North Korea number. And there were these other polls that came out around the same time that showed men in general were supporting Mamdani by substantial margins, that young people were supporting Mamdani by substantial margins. And there's a kind of sense that if you listen to, what I call the broadcasters, the manosphere, the podcasters, that they're inherently reactionary. And they're not inherently reactionary. They're rebelling against a certain kind of, what used to be political correctness, what we would now call wokeness, the sort of, you can't say this, you can't say that. And they hate that, and they reject that. And so, but the core of the appeal is anti-establishment, right? That they're alienated from kind of traditional career paths. They're alienated from traditional politics. There's nothing that Chuck Schumer can say to a 25-year-old dude. And so when somebody can speak to that audience authentically, they're willing to take a flyer on the left or the right. So, I mean, Joe Rogan, before he voted for Trump, voted for Bernie Sanders. Joe Rogan is not going to vote for Hillary Clinton. Joe Rogan's not going to vote for Chuck Schumer. He might vote for Marjorie Taylor Greene. He might vote for AOC. And so that alignment is something that I think is pretty important.
Would he vote for Mandani?
That I couldn't tell you. That I don't know.
Thanks to Michael Hirschorn, Chief Executive of Ish Entertainment, guest columnist on the opinion pages of the New York Times. And that's it for this edition of Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program anytime, anywhere.